Hello everyone. In this episode we're going to talk about classic theories of economic development. And these are theories and approaches that emerged in the period of the 1950s through the 1980s. In some sense they followed each other sequentially, although they overlapped and debate continued actively, as it sometimes does to this day, certainly. We call these the classic theories. They're divided into four approaches in this way. And so they are the linear stages of growth model. And this is associated in terms of growth theory with the linear growth model. That is the topic of a separate episode, which thought about things more broadly than just growth models. But that did emphasize as one of their important points the role of investment, hence their association with the Harry-Domar growth model. The theories and patterns of structural change, to some extent the linear theories were seen not to be universally applicable, and so the idea here on the empirics was to look instead at the general patterns, not universal, but try to see what the typical steps are in the development process and see how much individual countries deviated from those broad patterns and think about what it means. And there were theories of structural change. The most famous is the Lewis model. We're not covering it in this semester. Then there's the international dependence revolution that saw the problems of development, not a lack of structural change or lack of investment, but really having to do with unequal international economic relations that stemmed from colonialism. And then finally, the neoclassical free market counter-revolution, as it's sometimes thought of in its reference to the dependence revolution. It emphasized the free market approach and pinned problems of economic development on government, rather than seeing government as being part of a necessary solution. So all of these four theories has some strengths and some limitations, and we'll say a few things about each one. So a classic statement about linear stages, aside from the well-known Harry-Domar growth model, was given by Walt Rostow. This was the stages of growth approach. He introduced it in 1955 and turned it into a book form in 1960. It had a couple additional editions. It was quite influential. He said every society that successfully industrializes and fully develops has to go through 5 stages. The first is traditional society. This is what happens before industrialization gets started. Every country started with a traditional society. Agriculture, certainly if there's been at least an agricultural revolution, but agriculture, low productivity, and rather traditional ideas and norms. Then at some point preconditions for takeoff take place, and he said that one of them, among several, including changes in norms and attitudes, but among several, he said that investment rates had to reach a certain threshold. He said 17% at one point in time. Then there's a takeoff into sustained economic growth. Then there's a drive to maturity, and finally a developed stage, which is an age of high mass consumption, which was in part describing the way that the industrialized countries were appearing in the 1950s to early 60s. And as I say, it's often associated with the Harry-Domar, sometimes called the AK growth model, and that is a separate video or episode. So criticisms of the stages model, well, first of all, is necessary versus sufficient conditions. So just taking this one notion that investment has to increase substantially, it may very well. However, just investing a lot more is not a sufficient condition. Investing in the right things with high efficiency at the right time, all of that matters. And so it's by no means a given that if investment goes up, it'll go to productive uses that lead to successful economic development. Also, if you talk too broadly about how your theory is applicable everywhere, you really are setting yourself up for problems. If there are examples of countries that had all the preconditions and you describe yourself, as Walt Rostow did in the case of Argentina, as moving into the takeoff phase and moving even toward the drive to maturity. or about to do so, and so that if you then see development reversing in those countries, that's a problem for your theory. And that's what was seen pretty clearly in the case of Argentina. And so I suggest that you, to get a better idea, delve into the case study at the end of chapter 3, comparing that experience of Argentina with a very different experience, which was South Korea, which the stages of growth approach, which Rostov's approach, specifically did not point out as a country likely to develop and industrialize, and yet it did. And so, nonetheless, some of the ways that you can describe South Korea's development over time actually worked fairly well in comparison with this theory. So just as an aside, we're not covering the Lewis two-sector model. This is often associated also with the stages or patterns of growth. So empirically, some processes are very typical, but not universal. And so that if we more or less give up on the idea of a single theory that will explain all development experiences or all successful ones, we still will find it very interesting to find typical cases. So across many indicators, an investment would only be one: education, health, many of the things that we study in the class institutions. What are associated with economic development at different stages of income per capita, for example, across the world? And then you find it of interest to see how individual countries conform to or deviate from these broad statistical common patterns. And these common patterns are sometimes called stylized facts. So some people call this the stylized facts approach, the empirical patterns approach, because of the fact that, well, it's not a fact that applies everywhere, but applies most of the time in many circumstances. So first, at some point, the term stylized fact caught on here. And some of these are quite obvious from what we've already thought about in the first couple of weeks. We see a shift from agriculture to industry and also to services. We see rural-urban migration, urbanization. Clearly, the higher income countries are much more urbanized as they are shifted in terms of employment out of agriculture. Steady accumulation of capital, physical as well as human capital, education, and also health. Others that are not quite so obvious that we'll look at as we go through the course. In chapter 6, we'll see that one implication of the way that economies develop is that population growth is likely to first increase and then decrease over time as family size, number of children, gets smaller. There are other ideas that were associated with this group, led by Hollis Chenery, Moshe Sirquin, Sherman Robinson, and some others. But some of the ideas just didn't work out that well over time. It looked, and they argued that there was a clear relationship between inequality and economic development, but as more and more data became available, some of these ideas had to be revised, which is good for empirical work. International dependence revolution decided that a better way to think about problems of development is to look at the long colonial history in particular, but even more general than that, look at unequal economic relations, as they called them, between the rich industrialized world and the rest of the world, what they sometimes called it the West and the rest as a shorthand. And so the idea here is that the legacy of colonialism, we've already seen, in fact, did lead in many, many cases in the developing countries to bad institutions that made development difficult to get underway or certainly to maintain over time. That there was otherwise unequal power between the high-income and low-income countries as manifested in different international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, and they viewed the economy as having been organized between what they called the core and the periphery, the high-income countries that did the industrialization and the low-income countries that supplied the raw materials, possibly at low prices, and the basic agriculture goods and mining and so on, just to put it in a somewhat simplified way. And there were different approaches. I'm just going to name a couple. The first is this false paradigm model. And here, it's really somewhat benign. It just says that, look, the rich countries don't mean badly by this. They're trying to help, and they send advisors out, And the advisors are trained in Western universities, in high-income country universities, and they've learned about conditions in those economies so that economists study places where markets function well. If they see places in other parts of the world where markets are not functioning well, they may think about the solutions in terms of what they're used to in their countries and so on, whether it has to do with regulation or other activities. However, if these ideas, however well they might work, say in Britain, don't work out so well in, let's say, Kenya, the result can be rather devastating if you're using inappropriate policies. And so this was one idea, and you therefore needed to think about new theories and approaches and strategies that were based on the reality in the less developed countries. And then there's a dualistic development thesis, and this is a little bit less benign, even if not always conscious. Sometimes it's just the mechanism of the market, but they see the coexistence and long-term stability between what they call, in some cases, the superior and inferior elements, the high productivity side and the low productivity side. And these coexist over time. Also associated with this is the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis that says that over time, the goods that the developing countries end up specializing in because of market pressures, namely agricultural goods and mining kinds of goods, extracted resources, these sorts of goods tend to decline in price over time relative to manufactured goods. They decline in part because substitutes can be found and are found. They keep the prices down. And because there's possibilities of more continuous productivity gains in manufacturing. There was much to be said for this school, but a big problem had to do with what the policy implications were. And so one policy implication, such as this Prebisch-Singer idea that through international trade you're locking yourself into the wrong goods that you're exporting, is to be more protective, to have more protection. And so that some countries certainly tried this. It was very commonly tried in developing countries. China and India were two countries that tried it. If any country was going to be successful, it would be the largest countries in the world. And each of them at different stages decided that it just wasn't working, that to successfully develop, they had to be more integrated in the world. China by 1980, India by about 1990. And so at the same time, you had examples of countries that had actively integrated into the world economy and been successful. South Korea, the case study at the end of chapter 3, is a good example. Another example is Taiwan. These two countries are compared at the end of chapter 12, as each took active trade strategies to try to leverage their way into successful economic development. But these were cases of economies that had done what the dependency school suggests maybe you don't want to do, which is to highly integrate yourself with the developed world economies, and yet had done well. And so for a while there was the idea among the dependency school that, well, these are special cases. These are, Taiwan, South Korea are kind of bulwarks against communist expansion, and so you're going to invest in those countries. But over time, as more and more countries started to follow the example set by South Korea, for example, then as a result, it became harder to stretch the theory to encompass those areas. So that's the limitation here. It has to do with thinking about the best policies. And then in the 1980s, in significant measure in response to the neocolonial kinds of approaches, dependency revolution approaches that emphasize active government involvement in order to develop the economy in a way that it would not through market forces by integrating with the rest of the world. This school located problems of developing countries not with the rich countries and the world economy, but with the activities of governments themselves that had not done such a great job. Well, they denied that intervention, which was supposed to help grow, the countries grow and develop, had been efficient at all. So they just denied the efficiency of different government policy interventions in the economy. many developing countries had made active use of state-owned enterprises in order to try to jumpstart the economy and make sure that there was investment directed in the sectors and the activities that were consistent with the national plan. But they pointed out that many state-owned enterprises had in fact turned out to be very inefficient, and that has been a highly influential finding. They stress that, well, there may be market failures, but typically in this view, government failures were usually even worse. And so that as a result, there should be more reliance on what was called the magic of the marketplace. This school, rightly or wrongly, but it's associated with a different formal model of growth, the solo growth model, and that will also be a separate episode focusing on that in detail. So then just to wrap up, can we reconcile the differences? Well, we still think that we learn something from all of these schools. So governments do fail, but also markets fail. And so some balance between making use of markets, and in particular, it's a very powerful force in terms of providing incentives to invest and get things done broadly. But markets do fail and governments fail. We need some kind of balance. And also we have to pay attention to the institutional realities, the political realities that are found in the developing world. We can't just assume that markets will immediately work in all of these cases, but the same is true. We can't assume government can work necessarily either. So there's no universally accepted paradigm, and we'll see that there are some very influential new contemporary theories about why development doesn't succeed and what it might take for successful development. Coordination failure is a major part of that, as we'll see in detail when we get to chapter 4. Our insights and understandings are continually evolving, and so that each theory, as we've seen, has some weaknesses as we've gone through them, but also some strengths. And so with that, we'll finish this episode, and we will have a chance to talk about all this. Thank you.